Elena Rivera stood frozen at the steps of the city morgue, a thin manila envelope clutched in her trembling hands. Inside it was all she had left, her mother's death certificate, a worn-out hospital bill, and an invoice from the funeral home that stared at her with the cold finality of a number she could never afford. $18,000. That was the price of a proper burial in New York City. The cheapest coffin, the simplest ceremony, and the plot in a shared graveyard. Nothing extravagant, but still something her mother had deserved, and Elena had less than $200 in her bank account. The woman at the front desk had been polite, almost apologetic, but rules were rules. No payment meant no arrangements. She had until Friday to come up with the money, or her mother's body would be transferred to a mass cremation facility, unclaimed and undignified. She walked the streets of the Bronx that evening without knowing where her feet were taking her. Her apron from the diner still hung around her waist. She had just finished her evening shift when the hospital had called. Her mother was gone. Pancreatic cancer had won, stealing her in silence. Elena had rushed across town, but she had been too late. Now she felt suspended in a reality that didn't belong to her, a life that had cracked open and fallen apart without warning. She sat on the cracked curb near a closed laundromat, head in hands, the city buzzing around her like a stranger. She had always tried to be good, studied hard, worked harder, took care of her mother when the rest of the world forgot them, but goodness didn't pay funeral bills, didn't count in a world ruled by numbers and signatures. She pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, then began to type. The message was simple, raw, desperate. I am selling my virginity. One night, no strings, $18,000, serious offers only. She hit send before she could regret it. The message was posted anonymously on a private adult forum she had stumbled upon once by accident and never returned to. But tonight, she needed it. Her heart pounded so loud she couldn't hear the city anymore. Just minutes later, the replies started coming in. Some were cruel, others were vile. She wanted to throw the phone into the gutter. Then came a message, with no introduction, just an address and a time. And a name, Jace Montgomery. She didn't recognize it at first, but a quick search told her everything. CEO of a rising tech conglomerate, Harvard dropout turned billionaire, known for being ruthless in business and colder in personal matters. There were tabloid whispers about him never seen with the same woman twice. Impossible to reach, impossible to know. The message was short. I will pay you in full, one night, no repeats, no attachments. It made her stomach turn, but she wasn't allowed the luxury of shame. She accepted. 48 hours later, she stood in front of the Waldorf Astoria, wearing a thrift store black dress that fit a little too tight around the shoulders. Her fingers shook as she stepped inside. Everything around her smelled like money and detachment. She didn't cry that night, not when she walked into the penthouse, not even when she handed him a copy of her ID, not even when he counted the money in front of her and handed her a black duffel bag full of cash. But the moment he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, she closed her eyes and pictured her mother's smile. That's when the tears finally came. She thought it would end there, that she would disappear with the money and bury her past along with her mother. But life has a strange way of refusing to follow our plans. Something unexpected was about to happen, something Elena never thought she would ever feel again, not after what she did. Elena had never believed in fairy tales. She grew up in a one-bedroom apartment above a bodega in the South Bronx, the kind of place where you could hear arguments through the thin walls and sirens echoing through the night. Her mother, Maria Rivera, had been everything to her, a seamstress with tired hands and a kind heart, working 12-hour shifts in a small factory to make sure Elena had food on the table and shoes that weren't falling apart at the seam. Life had never been easy, but Elena had never complained. She learned early that silence was strength and that self-respect wasn't something you waited for. It was something you carried with you like armor. From the time she was 14, she worked part-time jobs, cleaned apartments, waited tables, folded clothes at discount stores. She saved every tip. every spare dollar, hoping one day she could take her mother somewhere warm and quiet, somewhere without pain or debt or noise. But cancer took all of that away before Elena could even try. Her mother's illness had started with fatigue, then pain in her back, then came the hospital visits, the diagnosis, and the quiet look in her doctor's eyes that said hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Insurance barely covered the basics, and everything else fell on Elena's shoulders. By the time Maria passed, Elena had dropped out of college, worked double shifts at a local diner called Rosie's, and was constantly behind on rent. Yet, she had stayed strong, even when her body was tired and her eyes burned from crying in the break room during her 15-minute breaks. She had no siblings, no close friends, and no one to ask for help. When she made the decision to sell her virginity, it wasn't because she didn't care about herself. It was because no one else cared either, and the world hadn't left her with many options. She promised herself it would be one time, and then never again. Jace Montgomery was the last kind of man she imagined would answer that message. Everything about him seemed far removed from her world, born into privilege, raised in penthouses and private schools. His name was plastered across tech blogs and finance magazines. His company, Venturo, had become one of the fastest-growing AI firms in the country. Everyone admired him, feared him, some even hated him, but no one could ignore him. He wasn't like the other men who replied to her post with crude jokes and cruel offers. His message had been cold but clear. He didn't ask questions, didn't request photos, just an address, a time, and a promise. At first, she thought maybe it was fake, maybe someone was playing with her, but when she looked him up and realized it really was him, something inside her froze. She had expected someone older, someone arrogant or vulgar, but when she stepped into that penthouse, Jace wasn't what she imagined. He was tall, yes, and sharp-featured, with pale eyes and a jaw that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He didn't speak much, didn't touch her until she nodded, and even then it was with a strange sort of detachment, like he was checking off a task rather than sharing a moment. He didn't ask her name again, didn't ask why she was doing it, and when it was over, he simply stood, dressed, and handed her the money as promised. She remembered staring at the stack of bills in disbelief. It felt heavier than guilt. And yet, for the first time in months, she could finally breathe. Not because she felt free, but because she could finally fulfill her mother's wish. 3 days later, her mother was buried at St. Agnes Cemetery in a quiet corner under a tree. Elena wore her mother's old church dress and placed a single lily on the grave. She whispered promises no one else could hear and stood there long after the others had gone, until the sky turned orange and the wind picked up, and the world reminded her she still had to survive it. After the funeral, she planned to leave New York for a while, maybe move to Jersey, take some time to disappear, to forget what she had done and what it had cost her. But before she could act on that plan, she received an email, one she hadn't expected. It was from a recruitment agency she had applied to months before, long before everything had fallen apart, and attached to it was a formal job offer for a temporary administrative position at a corporate firm in Midtown Manhattan. The offer seemed generic at first, but as she scrolled down, the company name caught her breath. Venturo. She didn't know if it was fate or coincidence or some cruel trick the universe was playing on her, but something in her told her to go, not because she wanted to see him again, but because maybe this was a second chance. Maybe this was her way back to something normal. She printed the contract, bought the cheapest office clothes she could find at a clearance store, and told herself that whatever happened next, she wouldn't let anyone define her by what she had done. Elena arrived at Venturo's glass tower with a stomach full of nerves and a heart wrapped in quiet determination. The lobby was polished and cold, flooded with natural light and the scent of fresh coffee and ambition. Men in tailored suits and women in heels moved through it like they belonged, like they knew they mattered. Elena stepped up to the reception desk, clutching her ID and offer letter. her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. The receptionist smiled politely, handed her a visitor's badge, and pointed her toward the elevators. She didn't ask questions, didn't recognize Elena, didn't know the story that had been briefly whispered across tabloid blogs just weeks ago, before fading into the digital abyss. The elevator carried her to the 43rd floor, the temporary placement department, where she was met by a friendly HR manager named Dana, who handed her a folder and showed her to a shared workstation. The desk was clean, minimal, and tucked between two high cubicle walls. It was impersonal, and Elena felt thankful for that. It meant anonymity, distance, safety. For the first few hours, she kept her head down, inputting data, reviewing spreadsheets, quietly absorbing the rhythm of the office. No one spoke to her beyond polite greetings, and she didn't mind. It was better that way, safer that way. Until just past noon, when everything changed, a voice rang out from behind her, firm and unmistakably familiar. "Miss Rivera?" She turned slowly, every cell in her body tensing as she met the eyes she had hoped not to see again. Jace Montgomery stood in the corridor, not 10 feet from her, dressed in his usual black suit, no tie, sharp and unreadable, his gaze locked on her like he was trying to decide whether she was real or some hallucination summoned by exhaustion. She swallowed hard, nodded once, then stood. "Yes, sir?" she said, the words formal and cold, trying to hide the burn in her cheeks. Jace looked at her for a long second, then turned to the HR manager, who had just entered behind him. "I'd like to speak with her, in private." The manager hesitated but nodded, gesturing toward a nearby conference room. Elena followed Jace without a word, the room silent except for the quiet hum of the AC unit and the weight of unspoken things between them. When the door clicked shut, he turned to her, voice low. "What are you doing here?" She lifted her chin. "I was hired through a temp agency. I didn't know this was your company until after I accepted." His eyes narrowed slightly, not with suspicion, but something more complicated. "You should have said no. Why? Because it might be awkward for you?" she asked. "I need this job. I'm not here to make trouble." He exhaled, looked away, then back at her. "This isn't about trouble. It's about context." She folded her arms. "Then let's keep the context out of it. You don't owe me anything, and I don't want anything from you. Let me do the job I was hired to do, and we won't have to speak again." That should have been the end of it, she thought, as she left the room and returned to her desk. But Jace's silence followed her like a shadow. Over the next 2 weeks, he didn't speak to her. Not directly, but she noticed small things. Her team suddenly had better equipment. She was assigned tasks that actually challenged her. Her pay was quietly upgraded. When she tried to refuse, HR simply told her it had been a company-wide correction. She knew it wasn't, but she didn't press. One Friday evening, as she stayed late finishing a report, the office emptying around her, she heard the soft sound of shoes approaching. Jay stood at her cubicle entrance, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you're still on Diner Blend," he said, placing 1 cup on her desk. "This is better." She stared at the cup, then up at him. "You don't have to do this." "I know," he replied. "I just wanted to." And then he left. After that, things began to shift, slowly, quietly. One night, when a sudden summer storm hit and she was caught without an umbrella, he pulled up beside her in a sleek black car. "Get in, you'll be soaked," he said simply. She hesitated, then slid into the seat. He didn't speak as he drove, didn't look at her, just handed her his jacket when she shivered. It smelled faintly of cedar and something clean. That night, he dropped her at her apartment building without a word, and as she turned to thank him, he finally spoke. "You deserved better," he said softly. "That night, I know why you did it, but you deserved better." Her breath caught, but she said nothing. She just nodded and stepped out of the car. Their connection deepened not through grand gestures, but through the cracks, the quiet moments, the shared silences. He asked about her mother once, his voice low, respectful. She told him about Maria, about her strength, her quiet pride. how she'd taught Elena to sew and to dream, even when dreams didn't fit into their lives. Jace listened, really listened, and didn't interrupt. Then one day, he invited her to lunch not in the office cafeteria but in a small family-owned Italian place in the village. Over pasta and wine, he spoke about his childhood, about a mother who had loved the spotlight more than her son, a father who had disappeared behind lawsuits and mistresses. Money was never the problem, he said. Love was. Elena said nothing for a long time, then reached across the table and touched his hand. He didn't pull away. Still, she didn't trust it. Not fully. And when she found herself smiling at his texts or waiting for him to show up at her cubicle, she scolded herself. This wasn't real. He didn't do relationships. She was a scar in his memory, not a person in his future. Then one evening, after a long day, he invited her to his penthouse, not for dinner, not for drinks, but simply because he wanted her company. She almost didn't go, but something pulled her there. When she arrived, he was barefoot, in a black t-shirt, his hair messy from what looked like stress. "You want wine?" he asked. She nodded. They drank in silence, watching the city lights blink beneath them. At one point she stood to leave, but he stopped her, fingers brushing hers. "Stay," he said softly, "just for a while." She did. They talked until dawn, and something shifted between them, not rushed, not forced, just two people learning to be near each other without fear. When he finally kissed her again, it was nothing like that first night. It was gentle, full of questions and apologies, and all the things neither of them had said out loud. She felt safe, and for the first time in a long time she felt wanted, not because of what she could give, but because of who she was. Still, the world outside had sharp edges, and the past never stays buried for long. It began with a whisper, a subtle shift in the way people glanced at her when she passed by in the hallway. Not with curiosity, but with recognition. Elena noticed it first when she entered the office on a Monday morning, and two interns quickly looked away, their hushed voices trailing behind her like smoke. She told herself it was nothing. Paranoia, perhaps, or the anxiety of letting someone into her heart when she had spent so long keeping everyone out. But by Wednesday the whispers had grown louder, and on Thursday her name appeared in the subject line of a forwarded email sent to her by mistake. The attachment was a screenshot from an old online thread, a blurry image of her standing outside the Waldorf Astoria. The caption beneath it read, "Virgin for sale, 18,000 cash, no strings attached." Her stomach dropped, cold sweat prickling at the back of her neck as she stared at the screen, the air around her suddenly too thin. She closed the email without reading more and sat frozen at her desk, her hands trembling, her thoughts racing in every direction, but still stuck in place. By lunchtime, the silence became suffocating. HR called her into a private office, and the tone was sympathetic but professional. They asked if she was okay, if she needed to take personal time. They did not mention Jace directly, but it was clear they knew, or at least suspected, what had happened between them. Elena left the meeting feeling like a shadow of herself. She wanted to disappear, to erase every trace of that night, every dollar, every second, every look she had allowed herself to believe might be love. That evening, she went straight to her apartment and didn't answer any of Jace's texts. The next morning, she woke to find her building plastered with tabloids. Someone had shoved under the doors, her photo now attached to his name in headlines that screamed scandal and speculation. She had no idea how it had leaked. Maybe someone from the hotel? Maybe a tech rival trying to destroy him? Maybe fate simply decided it had given her too many soft moments and now came to collect. She packed her things quietly that night and left the apartment before dawn. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, not even Jace. She took the early train to Philadelphia, where an old coworker had offered her a couch months ago, and for a few days she breathed different air, worked at a bookstore, wore her hair in a low bun, and introduced herself only as Lena. She turned off her phone, avoided the internet, tried to rebuild her walls from the outside in. But pain has a way of traveling with you no matter how far you go. It waits in the pauses between moments, in the silence between breaths. And for Elena, it waited in the memory of his voice calling her name softly in the dark. Jace searched for her, not publicly but relentlessly. He went to her old apartment, spoke with the building manager, checked hospitals, even visited Rosie's diner where the owner told him she had disappeared without a word. He didn't make speeches, didn't call in favors, didn't send private investigators. Instead, he sat in the silence of his penthouse and stared at the photo he kept of her in his phone. One he had taken secretly on the night she helped him with a late report, her hair messy, her eyes focused, her lips slightly parted in concentration. It wasn't meant to be romantic, but somehow it had become the most important image he carried. The media storm around them only grew. Board members demanded explanations, investors began to question his judgment. Pressure mounted, like a rising tide, until the company he had built from the ground up threatened to collapse beneath his silence. Then came the worst blow of all. His former fiancée, Bianca Loren, suddenly reappeared in the press, giving interviews about the broken engagement, claiming emotional trauma, suggesting he had used women like toys. One reporter even asked about Elena directly during a product launch. The question hit like a slap, and Jace answered with his signature coldness. No comment. But inside, he felt something crack. That night, he looked up every piece of coverage about Elena, every thread, every cruel comment, every lie that twisted the truth of who she was and what she had done. He read it all until he couldn't breathe. Then he made a decision. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Elena tried to move on, but her heart betrayed her. She found herself checking the news again, looking for his name, wondering if he had replaced her in his life the same way she had tried to erase him from hers. One morning, she walked past a corner store and froze as she saw his face on the front page of the New York Times. The headline made her knees go weak. Montgomery defends woman at center of scandal, calls her heroic. She bought the paper with the last few dollars in her wallet and read every word. Jace had given an interview, his first in over a year, in which he admitted to purchasing a night with Elena, but framed it not as exploitation but as a testament to sacrifice. He spoke of her strength, of the reasons behind her choice. He said the world was too quick to judge those who do desperate things to survive. He didn't try to make himself look good. He didn't mention his own reputation. He only spoke of her. The closing quote read, "I don't regret meeting her. I regret not standing beside her from the beginning." Elena didn't cry right away. She sat with the paper pressed to her chest, heart beating like a war drum. For the first time since everything fell apart, she allowed herself to believe that maybe she hadn't imagined it all, that maybe the look in his eyes when he touched her hand had been real. That night, she called him. When he answered, he didn't speak, didn't ask where she was. He just waited. She took a deep breath. "I read what you said," she whispered. He exhaled. "I meant every word. Do you still want to see me?" "Every day, Elena." She closed her eyes and let the weight of those words pull her home. Elena returned to New York with a heart that didn't know whether to break or heal. The city looked the same, but it felt different now, more exposed, like every street remembered her. The news had cooled, but whispers still lingered. Some people stared, others smiled carefully, trying not to show that they recognized her from a scandal-turned-love story playing out in real time. Jace met her outside Penn Station without security, without fanfare, just him standing alone in a navy coat with tired eyes and a softness she had never seen before. When their eyes met, she didn't run, she didn't speak. She just walked into his arms, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to rest. They didn't rush anything, not this time. No hotels, no rushed nights or secrets. They walked through the city like people trying to remember how to be close again. They ate hot dogs from a cart, sat in Central Park and watched children chase bubbles. He held her hand like it was the most important thing in the world, and when she looked at him, She didn't see the billionaire or the man who had once bought her body. She saw someone trying to be worthy of her trust. But reality has a way of interrupting peace, especially when peace was never built to last. 2 weeks after her return, Jace was summoned to a closed-door meeting with the company's board of directors. Elena knew it was coming. He had warned her, told her the pressure hadn't stopped, that some investors were threatening to pull out if he didn't publicly distance himself from the controversy and from her. She told him she would understand if he needed to step back. She even offered to leave the city again, to give him space. But he only shook his head, reached for her hand and said, "I already lost you once. I won't do it again. No amount of stock options is worth that." The meeting was brutal, questions fired like bullets, accusations thrown like knives. They painted him as irresponsible, accused him of compromising the brand. Some even suggested that Elena had blackmailed him, that she was manipulating him. He sat through it all with his back straight and his voice calm, and when it was finally his turn to speak, he stood and said only this: "I built this company from nothing. I gave it my name, my time, my life. But if the price of keeping it is turning my back on the only person who ever saw me as more than a dollar sign, then you can keep your shares. I'll start over if I have to, but I won't be owned by fear." The room went silent. Some resigned on the spot, others sat stunned, but no one could deny that what he said came from truth. That night he came home to Elena, exhausted but free. He told her everything, and she listened without interrupting. Then she cupped his face in her hands and whispered, "You chose me." And he replied, "I always did, even when I was too proud to admit it." They spent that night in each other's arms, not as escape, but as a rival. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds between them, still questions about how the world would treat their love. But there was also something unshakable forming between them now, something deeper than desire, stronger than fear. Over the following weeks, they slowly returned to a rhythm. Jace worked to rebuild trust inside the company, while Elena accepted a position with a nonprofit that supported women in crisis. She spoke to survivors, mentored young girls, used her experience not as a weight but as a torch. Her story went viral again, but this time the headlines were different. Former scandal target, now advocate for change. The girl who rose after she fell. But not everyone was ready to let go of the past. Bianca Loren reappeared, not in gossip columns this time, but in lawsuits. She filed a defamation suit against Jace, claiming his recent interview damaged her reputation and mental health. Her lawyers demanded a settlement in the millions. The media latched on instantly, calling it the love triangle that refused to die. Elena tried to ignore it, but the pressure mounted daily. One morning she woke up to find her image spray-painted on the nonprofit's front door, along with the word liar. It shook her, not because she feared the attack, but because it reminded her how quickly the world turned on women like her, women who made messy choices in public, who refused to apologize for survival. Jace offered to move them out of the city, even out of the country, to disappear until things calmed down. But Elena said, "No, this is my life now. I won't run from it anymore, and I won't ask you to either." The case dragged on, the media circus returned, but through it all they held on to each other, not with perfection but with persistence. There were nights Elena cried herself to sleep, nights Jace stayed up reading every article just to prepare for whatever hit came next, and through it all, they never broke apart. At the final court hearing, Jace spoke under oath, his voice unwavering as he defended Elena's name, her choices, her strength. He looked straight at Bianca and said, "You're not the victim here, and you don't get to rewrite the story to make yourself feel important again." The courtroom went quiet. The judge dismissed the case the same day. They walked out of the courthouse hand in hand. The world didn't stop judging, but it started listening. They were no longer just scandal or fantasy, no longer just a rich man and a girl with a past. They had become something else entirely, something rooted in the hard soil of truth and choice. That night, Jace took Alina to the rooftop of the building where he had first kissed her. The skyline stretched wide behind them, the wind soft and full of city lights. He held out a small velvet box, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. "I don't care if the world never accepts us," he said. "I just want to build a life with the only person who ever saw me clearly. Will you marry me?" Alina didn't cry this time. She smiled, wide and real, then whispered yes, not because she needed a new beginning, but because she had already found her home. 3 months passed, not in silence but in rebuilding. Ellen and Jace moved into a brownstone tucked away in a quiet corner of Brooklyn, far from the skyscrapers and spotlights that had once defined their every move. The days became slower, filled with mundane comforts. Early morning coffee, shared glances over open laptops, arguments about groceries and pillow arrangements, things that felt ordinary but in truth were anything but. Because for them, ordinary was a victory. Elena kept working with the nonprofit, now as a director of outreach. Her face had become a symbol, not of shame, but of strength. And women from across the country wrote to her, some seeking advice, others simply thanking her for not hiding. She replied to every letter. Jace, too, found his footing again. The storm had passed, and though some board members had left, others stayed, and Venturo continued to grow under new leadership values. He no longer led with distance, but with presence. His time with Elena had changed the way he viewed power. He no longer measured success in stock prices, but in how many people stayed after they learned his full story. They were planning a quiet wedding, just close friends and a small garden ceremony, nothing extravagant, nothing staged. Alina wanted her vows to be spoken in sunlight, not in spotlights. But one afternoon, as she was reviewing venue options, she received a call from her doctor. It had started with exhaustion, the kind she assumed came from stress or the long work hours, but the doctor's voice on the other end of the phone was calm and clear. She was pregnant. The words sank in slowly, not like a wave, but like a whisper that became thunder. For a moment, she said nothing, her hand pressed flat against her stomach, as if trying to feel the truth forming inside her. When she told Jace that evening, he didn't speak right away. He reached for her hand and just held it. Then he leaned in and said, "Thank you." Not as if she had done something for him, but as if the universe had done something for them both. That night, they lay awake in bed, whispering about names and nursery colors, about fears and memories, about the kind of parents they never had and hoped to become. But joy has a shadow, and sometimes the past demands attention before the future can begin. Bianca reemerged, not with another lawsuit, but with a memoir, a book filled with half-truths and elegant lies. Interviews followed, media coverage returned, and once again, Elena's name was dragged into headlines she never asked for. Questions about the baby, about the timing, about whether this was all a long con staged by a girl from the Bronx with nothing to lose. It was cruel and exhausting, but this time Elena didn't run. She gave one interview, just one, where she sat on a simple couch, hands resting over her stomach, and said clearly, "I never asked for this attention. I never wanted fame. All I ever wanted was dignity for myself, for my mother, for my child. You can believe whatever you want, but I know the truth, and the man who loves me knows it too." The video went viral, not for its drama, but for its honesty, and something in the public shifted. The tide began to turn in her favor. Strangers sent flowers, letters, even donations to her nonprofit in her name. Jace watched it all unfold in quiet awe, realizing how far she had come, how much she had grown into her voice, into her power. Still, the twists that would test them the most had nothing to do with tabloids or reputations. At her 20-week scan, the doctor hesitated. The screen flickered slightly, and then came the words that wrapped around Elena's heart like ice. "There's a complication." The baby's heart had an abnormal rhythm, something that needed more testing, more monitoring, maybe even early delivery. The rest of the appointment passed in a blur, machines beeping, medical terms flying like birds too fast to catch. She walked out of the hospital in silence, Jace beside her, his hand on her back, their plans for soft music and baby books replaced by doctors' schedules and fetal specialists. For a week they said little, trying to stay hopeful, trying not to unravel. Jace would wake in the middle of the night and sit beside her, his hand resting on her stomach, his voice low as he whispered promises the baby couldn't yet hear. "Stay strong, little one. We're waiting for you." Elena watched him and felt something deeper than love, something like surrender. She wasn't afraid of motherhood. She was afraid of losing the life they had almost built, of seeing it slip through her fingers just when it had started to feel real. But strength was something they had learned not to fake, but to hold tightly to, even when their hands shook. 2 weeks later, a new specialist gave them better news. The abnormality could stabilize with time, with care, and while the baby would still need monitoring, the chances of a healthy birth were high. Alina cried in the car on the way home, her face buried in Jace's chest as he whispered, "We've got this," over and over, like a prayer. From that moment on, they began to prepare in earnest, not for a perfect child, not for a fairy tale family, but for a life filled with trying and hoping and choosing each other every day. The wedding was moved to early spring, the garden filled with soft music and folding chairs. Alina wore a simple white dress that curved gently over her growing belly. Jace wore no tie, just a quiet smile and eyes full of light. They said their vows under an old oak tree, hands intertwined, voices steady. "I don't promise perfection," Alina said. "I promise truth, and to always choose us, even when it's hard." Jace said, "I loved you before I had the courage to say it. And I will keep loving you long after this world forgets our names." That night, as they danced under fairy lights with friends and strangers cheering from the edges, as laughter and music filled the warm air, as the future pressed gently against the fabric of her dress, Alina realized something she hadn't dared believe back when everything began. Sometimes, the thing that saves you isn't escape. It's the choice to stay, to stand, to love through the fire until it becomes something that lights your way home. 6 months later, in the soft gray light of a quiet Tuesday morning, Elena gave birth to a baby girl with strong lungs and a heartbeat that sang with life. They named her Marisol, after Elena's mother. And when the nurses placed the baby in her arms, Elena didn't speak. She simply stared at the tiny face pressed against her chest and let the tears fall freely, not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming sense that somehow, after everything, she had made it through. Jace stood beside her, holding both of them as if he'd never let go again, and in that room filled with beeping monitors and whispered instructions, time seemed to pause, just long enough for them to feel whole. In the weeks that followed, the world outside kept spinning. People still talked, headlines still came and went, some praising, some doubting, but Alina no longer needed the world's approval to feel real. She had found her center not in Jace's wealth or in the validation of strangers, but in the quiet moments at 3 a.m. when she held Marisol against her shoulder and hummed lullabies her mother used to sing. They stayed in their Brooklyn home, filled the nursery with books and light and the scent of baby powder and coffee. Some days were hard, diapers and deadlines, fatigue and miscommunication, but even in the mess, even in the moments of doubt and exhaustion, they never stopped choosing each other. Jace, once the guarded billionaire who never believed in love, now sang to his daughter during bath time and kissed Elena's temple every morning before making her breakfast. Alina, once the desperate girl who sold her body for a grave, now stood tall in every room she entered, no longer ashamed of her past, but empowered by it, because it had led her here, not to perfection, but to purpose. On Marisol's first birthday, surrounded by a small group of friends, Elena gave a short speech, not planned, not polished, just honest. She spoke of her mother's strength, of the moment she nearly gave up, of the man who saw her not as broken but as brave. She said love is not what saves us, It's what we choose when we stop trying to survive and start trying to live. The room fell silent, not with discomfort, but with respect. And in that silence, she knew her story had become more than survival. It had become something that could light the way for others. Years later, when Marisol asked how her parents met, Elena didn't lie. She didn't give her the fairy tale version or the movie script ending. She simply said, "Sometimes the beginning of something beautiful looks like the end of everything. But if you hold on, if you fight for it, love has a way of rewriting even the darkest chapters." Because love, when it's real, doesn't just forgive your past, it builds a future with you, day by day, choice by choice.